Okay, it looks like everybody's well rested and returned from the break. It's my pleasure to present introduce the next talk by Professor William Northrop from University of Minnesota. This presentation will be delivered by Zoom. And okay, well, are you fine to start now?
Yes, I'm all set. If everybody's ready there.
Yep, we can hear you there. Good. Yep.
Excellent. Okay, I'll get started then. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to give this presentation to you all today. And I'm sorry that I can't be there in person to have in-person discussions, but hopefully my talk will inspire some discussions afterwards here. I'm going to be talking about internal combustion engines and ammonia's use in them. Specifically, I'm going to cover some recent work in advanced combustion modes and emissions challenges. I would say that my talk is going to be somewhat more applied than the last couple of talks, but I think it's complementary, certainly because engine combustion is certainly a relevant topic today, and there's a lot of research going on in this area. A lot of the work that we're doing at University of Minnesota is funded by the state of Minnesota, actually, through our large renewable energy program and interest in the agricultural sector. So just as a broad overview of ammonia combustion in engines, what are the major challenges that we face? On the right, you can see these are the OSHA diamonds that show the health hazards and flammability of different fuels. And we all know, as we've discussed already this morning, that there's low flammability of ammonia compared to hydrocarbon fuels like gasoline. However, there is a significant health hazard to ammonia in its storage and use. So as those of you who are experimentalists know in your laboratories, extra considerations and cautions are required when testing ammonia in your laboratories, and that's true in the field as well. And therefore, I think that ammonia is going to find its way into applications where it's going to be used in a more appropriate way and can be stored safely. So putting it on road is going to be difficult, but using it in off-highway applications like marine and agriculture is interesting. Just covering the main issues that I will cover a bit of each of these in my talk today. So the two different types of engines, of course, for compression ignition engines, auto ignition temperature is extremely high. So compression ratios required to auto ignite ammonia by itself are excessively high. Some studies show in the 30s, maybe higher compression ratio required at normal intake temperatures. Therefore, typical ammonia combustion in engines requires a diesel pilot. Now, as the residence time increases, therefore, as the engine sizes increase towards large shipboard engines, for example, the percentage of pilot fuel decreases. So we see that less pilot is required for larger engines. However, for higher speed and medium speed engines, the ammonia pilot has to, or the hydrocarbon diesel pilot has to increase. So we see that that is a major challenge, at least in the sense of using dual fuel. In terms of after treatment, lean conditions are very challenging for after treatment, as I'll discuss. And so these are, I know in gas turbine applications, this is being discussed as well as for engine applications, reciprocating engines. For spark ignition, relatively low flame propagation speed, which we've already discussed this morning. Hong Im's talk was very interesting. High ignition energy is required. Can tolerate operation without hydrogen addition, which has also been alluded to, but really in practical sense, low load and low temperature performance is very poor. And this is something that's been shown across all research groups, is that we can burn ammonia by itself, except that starting an engine and running at low loads is going to be very challenging, keeping coefficient of variance within reasonable bounds. So hydrogen in this case is generally used as the high reactivity fuel, and it needs to be generated or stored on board. So this is a challenge on a practical sense. So these are more practical considerations and kind of an overview of the material. Really what we're talking about is motivating ammonia for use in off-highway applications. Here I just talk about the main sectors that are of interest in the literature right now: distributed power, agriculture, marine, and locomotive. Obviously, locomotive in the US is important as we use engine-powered locomotives primarily. So, and marine is the big sector right now, especially a lot of interest in Asia. And my state where I'm from, in Minnesota, agriculture is where we have the most applications. So what we're talking about with ammonia combustion, usually, obviously, we've talked a lot about kinetics this morning. I'm not going to cover what others have done much better than me, but essentially what we need to think about are what are the pathways for these different pollutant emissions that we have to account for in practical combustion systems like engines. So NOx forms more readily, as we know. There's a fuel pathway that occurs, which is on the left-hand side of this particular sort of illustration of the very broad kinetics that happen with ammonia. Thermal denox is a known kinetic pathway for reducing NOx emissions, and that's something that I'm going to discuss. We see often in engine cylinders at combustion relevant timescales. So I think that's an interesting phenomena. Unburned ammonia is a huge challenge. An ammonia slip through engines. Incomplete combustion, low flame speed accounts for part of this, but really wall quenching and crevice volume effects are huge with ammonia. So this is something that needs to be considered, and looking at unburned ammonia is a major factor, considering the health hazards that I've already alluded to, and our ability to use lean after treatment to clean up any ammonia slip. And has been mentioned at the very end of the last talk. N2O is a key byproduct of ammonia emissions that needs to be accounted for. It's a 300 times CO2 greenhouse gas. It means that any amounts of ammonia, or I'm sorry, NO2 emitted over 20 ppm is considerable. It means that you might as well be using a hydrocarbon fuel as part of your fuel mix from a greenhouse gas perspective. So it's really important that we understand N2O and how it can be managed. And I think it's pretty obvious when looking at the kinetic pathways for N2O formation. N2O is one of the last steps in the chain before you reach N2 as the final product of oxidation. And obviously, if you cut that short, N2O is a pretty stable species. So it's going to end up being in the tailpipe, which is what we see. So this just kind of reviewing some literature on what we see from engine emissions, or looking at the broader emissions factors. And we look at Zeldovich from gasoline engine combustion. We know that this exists. And then some have seen, extremely higher emissions of NOx with gasoline plus ammonia. Now, this really just depends on temperature a lot. You can see that it's a very temperature dependent mechanisms faster at NO at lower temperatures, and as you move up, you of course get Zeldovich playing a role as well. So these are things that we need to account for when we're looking at ammonia combustion in engines specifically. Looking at both of these mechanisms is important, and I think, as a lot of the talks we're already talking about, these are being accounted for in some of the modeling that's going on around engines. Okay, so what we found that occurs in practical engine systems, and this is some work that comes out of my group, looking at spark ignition type engine configurations, and what we found essentially is that relative to a baseline condition, as you increase the intake temperature, you expect that, of course, the peak temperatures in the cylinder are going to increase, and the peak cylinder pressures will also increase. This is for a stoichiometric condition, of course. So for stoichiometric spark ignition engines, we don't see much oxygen in the expansion stroke, so we expect to see some of this reduction chemistry. And what we see is that, of course, for methane, which is shown in the blue, you expect that methane would follow the traditional sort of Zeldovich pathway, meaning that as you increase the peak cylinder temperatures, you increase the amount of NO and NO2 that is formed. But what we find in ammonia is that as we go to high temperatures and high compression ratios, we tend to have the opposite effect, where the increasing intake manifold temperature decreases NO2 pretty considerably. and so our NO and NO2 pretty considerably. And so what we see is that this thermal denox effect is occurring. We actually showed that this bears out with this like a very simple zero-dimensional quasi-dimensional model, looking at the in-cylinder temperature, predicted kinetics of the thermal denox mechanism at these different conditions, and we find that this is pretty much what's happening. One of the things that's a cautionary tale, however, about the thermal denox mechanism is that generally there's an equilibrium to be had with with NO and N2O. So if you have thermal denox, you generally you could make N2O as a byproduct. You can't have the NO reduction necessarily without in some way creating more N2O in the process, depending. So there's a low temperature equilibrium reaction that's it's possible during the high oxygen pathway. So this would be for like lean combustion, where you see that the low temperature chemistry dominates and the equilibrium dominates, and you end up getting N2O as a result of this. And then of course at high temperatures and fuel rich, then you get combustion. You end up getting equilibrium towards N2O, even though you're reducing NO at the same time. So certainly there's probably a sweet spot in here where you have the right amount of oxygen in the combustion chamber, and you can manage the thermal denox process such that you reduce both of these. But I certainly think this is a major challenge going forward, that both NOx and nitrous are both key components of what needs to happen in an engine cylinder. So what we find that, from a phenomenological perspective or from an emissions perspective, is that N2O is strongly influenced by equivalence ratio and ignition timing. On the left, you can see some other work in the literature showing that for lean air fuel ratios, as lambda increases, we tend to see an increase in N2O emissions. This corresponds really pretty well with increasing, so if you increase the exhaust temperature, you get a thermal denox effect in the lean conditions where you're reducing NO emissions, but N2O goes up. So then N2O becomes an issue. Obviously, if you're at 100 ppm and you multiply that by 300, you have 3% equivalent CO2 in the exhaust. So you're about halfway to lean diesel CO2 concentrations. So on the right hand side, you can see some work from rich equivalence ratio work that we've done at our university, and you can see that NO emissions and N2O emissions can be sort of simultaneously reduced as you go rich. N2O emissions follow a pathway essentially where as you get closer to stoichiometric, they are maximum, and then NO emissions as well. So if you can, as well as you can see in this plot that we're also managing based on intake temperature, you can see that it's fairly temperature insensitive at rich equivalence ratio, which is promising as we want to keep both of these pollutant emissions somewhat low. So moving on, so I thought I'd throw this in there because it's important for us to understand that if N2O really is a byproduct of engine combustion, unlike gas turbines, well, maybe in some gas turbines used in stationary applications, you can use catalysts to reduce N2O. What we find is that when we use on the upper left, this is some dual fuel work that we've done. And if you look at engine out N2O emissions over a range of ammonia energy fraction compared to diesel, in the right plot, if you can see my pointer here, use your laser pointer, so you can see on the right plot here, in the after treatment out, we are using a precious metal based oxidation catalyst, and you can see that we're increasing N2O emissions considerably as a function of ammonia energy fraction. So obviously a challenge and something that we need to consider, and choose catalysts that don't lead to this type of formation. Typically, as you see on the right here, this is some work done quite a while ago, looking at the effect of N2O formation over certain catalysts in a diesel engine sort of scenario. And what we can see is that diesel oxidation catalysts operating, under 350 degrees Celsius typically will have a high degree of N2O formation, as well as SCR catalysts and others reductive catalysts for NO and NO2 tend to make N2O. The iron zeolite catalysts are typically used for NO or nitrous reduction, and those work typically at higher temperatures. So it's important that we understand, the combination of catalysts is going to be important. N2O decomposition has been discussed, and N2O decomposition is different than SCR. It doesn't require ammonia to be used as a reductant, but essentially, or hydrogen. And in this case, however, that these catalysts are effective, and they can be effective at temperatures that are reasonable, especially with precious metal catalysts. However, they're very sensitive to oxygen concentration. So nitrous decomposition is feasible if you're running with a near stoichiometric type engine. So I just thought I'd throw that in there. I know this is more about combustion. And we're talking a little bit about, here we're looking at some of the laminar flame speed information that we understand for ammonia. And I think this has already been pretty well covered, so I'm not going to go too far into it. But needless to say that we know that in order to meet the blending requirements on a laminar flame speed perspective, you need to have hydrogen percentages in the 40s to 50s range in order to meet laminar flame speed. However, as though we've already discussed, and Hong Imstok did a really nice job of talking a little about the thermal diffusive effects of the speed up with laminar to turbulent flame speed for ammonia flames. This is some work from Jackie Chen's group from Sandia National Laboratories, who are working with a little bit and understanding some of these processes, and some of her work from a few years ago showed that although you require about a 40% to 45% hydrogen blend to match laminar flame speed over a range of equivalence ratio, the blow off speed is shown to be about 10 times higher through their DNS simulations. So their models showing obviously some of the same things that have been shown more recently with regards to speed up for ammonia hydrogen flames compared to what you would expect from the laminar flame speed. This is really promising because essentially it shows that we may need less hydrogen as we go forward in terms of blending. Okay, so moving on, I'm just going to talk briefly about some of the work that we're doing in or that has been done in dual fuel. So for medium duty engines, the discussion, of course, is around dual fuel for diesel. And so for diesel, we're talking about a decomposition catalyst that we've used as a thermochemical recuperation to understand how we can generate hydrogen on board to be able to replace diesel or replace diesel at a higher level. So, and still maintain really low ammonia slip. So in this case, there was a John Deere 4045 engine that was used. It was a 4-cylinder combustion ignition engine over a multi-mode test. We've developed a thermochemical recuperation reactor that is able to convert some of the ammonia to hydrogen that is used then to increase the reactivity of the fumigated ammonia fuel. And as we've already showed some of the results here, but essentially as a range of ammonia energy fraction, we can keep N2O emissions relatively far down, although they are elevated in between the 1 to 200 ppm range, which is not really acceptable. But if we look at the ammonia slip as well, we see considerable amount of ammonia slip, but compared to earlier work that uses just ammonia and a diesel together, we get a lot less slip. So we have a little more advantage with when you blend hydrogen in with the mixture. So I think this is a promising idea, is to increase the reactivity of ammonia even for the dual fuel combustion cases. All right, checking the time here. Okay, so essentially, if I just throw some questions here. So I think that a lot of cases ammonia is being discussed a lot for in diesel applications, because that's where the incumbent technologies are in marine. However, I think that we need to be looking more at spark ignition type approaches, mainly because of some of the issues I discussed around N2O and around the use of dual fuel. So essentially, if we go to a spark ignition concept, ammonia is it can be used directly. However, it's not as reactive. So what are the limits of operation, as I've discussed? How much hydrogen is needed to sustain low COV operation? And can SI ammonia reduce unburned ammonia and N2O emissions? And of course, if hydrogen is needed, where does it come from? So some of the work that we've done includes use of a CFR engine. The CFR engine is a low-speed engine that's quite quiescent. However, it's really good for understanding auto ignition and properties of fuel properties. So we've done a lot of work with emissions analyzers and in-cylinder combustion analysis with this platform. High compression ratio spark ignition, essentially we are running the engine close to 18:1 and in some cases higher. And we're showing, you know, compared to some of the work done by Roussel on the left, that we can run, the work on the left was with pure ammonia. So similar to what was shown earlier, we can run with 100% ammonia. And that is shown on the bottom right of this plot with COVs that are close to sub 2%, which is acceptable for spark ignition engines. And we can also show that we get adequate IMEP numbers from that, as was shown by Roussel and others. So, however, if you go to higher hydrogen amounts, you can obviously get higher efficiency, and you can improve combustion quite a bit with even small blends of hydrogen. So 2.5% or 5% by volume hydrogen is really appropriate. So you might ask, and one thing that we've asked is if even if there is some sort of turbulent flame speed increase, why is it okay to run ammonia at engine relevant timescales without very much hydrogen blending? One of the things that we found that leads to this story is that ammonia doesn't knock. So if you're thinking about ammonia as a fuel for SI engines, ammonia, we can't get it to knock at all. If we advance spark timing very far, we don't see that ammonia's ringing index goes up anywhere near what we get for, say, methane, which is shown in the blue. So methane will, of course, immediately knock and have high ringing very quickly. So we don't see this with ammonia at all. So we can run up to high compression ratios. In fact, we run a 20:1 compression ratio and still not seeing any significant knock. One of the things that I think is happening, and something that we're recently publishing, is that we're showing that pure ammonia operation with high compression ratio results in what's conventionally known as a spark assisted compression ignition, so, or SACI. So SACI, we're finding throughout most of the heat releases that we've been analyzing, and also this has been shown by Roussel and others, that there is this two-stage type combustion happening with ammonia combustion, especially with small amounts of hydrogen. And this may, on top of the turbulent flame speedups that we're seeing, may account for the short combustion durations, enabling low hydrogen amounts to be run in spark ignition concepts, which is quite promising. Okay, looks like I have about 5 more minutes here. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about the potential sources of hydrogen for high efficiency operation. So of course, if we do need to have some hydrogen available, and we don't need much, right? So we need 2.5% to 5% by volume hydrogen in the blend, in the fuel blend. we can consider a few different options. We can consider onboard hydrogen storage, which is impractical, catalytic ammonia decomposition in the intake, or dedicated EGR, which is another concept that we've been exploring here, and has been explored by others in the gasoline and natural gas engine world, as has been discussed by Alger et al. And others at Southwest Research. So in this case, you can run one engine cylinder rich while the others are running lean, and use that the products of that rich cylinder to feed the other cylinders, and provide hydrogen to those cylinders at the small amount that are required. So to investigate this concept, we looked at a range of equivalence ratio running up to a equivalence ratio of 1.4 inside the engine, and found that essentially as you're running this equivalence ratio up, you can achieve pretty stable combustion up to, and this is all pure ammonia going into the engine. You can, depending on the intake temperature and intake pressure, with boosted conditions, you can get up to about 6% hydrogen, which I'll show in the next slide actually, but we can keep the engine fairly stable up to about equivalence ratio of 1.35 or almost 1.4 before the engine quits. So this is promising. Can be an option for practical generation of hydrogen. So hydrogen production increases until the misfire limit, peaking at around 6%. So we can see that 6% hydrogen essentially is feasible. Of course, the unburned ammonia emissions are quite high, up to a couple percent. But if that's being feeding back into another cylinder, that shouldn't really be an issue from a emission standpoint. So that's one possible way that hydrogen could be made. Of course, another way is to be using the catalytic decomposition technology that's been developed, and some of the cracking technology that is available to use exhaust waste heat to decompose ammonia to hydrogen ammonia mixtures. This is just some final thoughts on hydrogen as an increasing portion of the exhaust. So this is some more of that work, but I may leave that off and move to my final summary. That essentially looking at an engine combustion, I think most would agree that ammonia is operable and viable as a fuel for internal combustion engines. I think compression ignition ammonia and high and medium speed engines requires a pretty considerable diesel substitution, and will have N2O emissions challenges that I think need to be addressed and understood. Unique features of ammonia combustion SI engines include the spark ignition, the spark assisted compression ignition concept that I've discussed, that has been seen in our group and others. Looking at decreasing combustion durations using that technique is promising. Hydrogen produced through in-cylinder reforming of ammonia is promising as well, and you could also consider using catalytic decomposition processes as well. And with that, I think I'll complete my talk, and we can start a discussion. Do you have any questions?
Thank you, Professor Northrop, for that great talk. Very interesting, covering a lot of areas in internal combustion engines. Okay, the talk is open for any questions from the audience. Got some microphones here to pass around. Okay. So.
Yeah, thanks very much. Nice presentation. Just wondering about the cold start problems. Is that an issue for your engines, and how do you go about fixing that?
Yeah, that certainly is an issue. I mean, we've been mostly running with single cylinder engines for ourselves. On the diesel that I'm showing here with this tractor, we did a field demo. That was started on pure diesel, and then once the engine was warm, we moved to ammonia substitution. What we expect for SI type combustion under cold start conditions is that you'll require you'll require hydrogen or pretty considerable intake heating. So those are both options that I think need to be looked at.
Does this mean a separate, you have to have a is this through cracking or another tank that you have to provide?
It's a good question. Yeah, there are a couple options. Yeah, one you could have a small startup hydrogen tank, which is obviously not that attractive. Another option is to have a small ammonia decomposition reactor that's fired either electrically, just to provide just enough. As I said, we don't need much hydrogen. We need a couple percent in the fuel. So yeah, it's a possibility. I know that companies like Ammonia have come up with small scale startup reactors that will provide some hydrogen within seconds. So something like that might need to be employed.
Okay, thanks. Get on it.
Actually, there's a question online from Agustin. So, Agustin, can you go ahead?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Hi, Agustin. Yes, I can hear you.
Hey, we are good. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Yes, I really interesting, very promising. Everything that you have done, and the papers are amazing. One of the big questions that I got, and I've been asking Christine and the group in Orleans, is about the reactive control strategies. So one of the things that I believe, again, up to my understanding in internal combustion engines, is that as you start producing all these different effects, especially N2O and NOxes, you can actually start using some additional ammonia, or then reducing the hydrogen that you're employing at the beginning. Again, they're making it more like reactive control. Have you explored this option, or what are your thoughts about that? Is there something promising around it?
I don't know if I understand what you're asking, Augustine. Are you asking like on the emissions control side, or are you looking at reactivity? Are you talking about reactivity control within the engine, in like like active combustion control?
Yeah, something about that, both of them actually, because, for example, starting the engine, I'm thinking again higher hydrogen content, perhaps, just to then get it up to the speed. Then you bring down the hydrogen, and then potentially, once that you have the combustion going at higher NOx emissions, N2O, you can actually put some ammonia to denox at the combustion chamber, just as you're saying, in a second cylinder. Yeah, something around that.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and I do think that there's going to be a lot of room for these unique combustion control strategies, because all these are intertwined emissions, and so that obviously the unburned ammonia we find is very advantageous for reducing NOx. So and so if we have unburned ammonia, which we're inevitably going to have because of crevice effects, and some of the slip that we're inevitably going to have, I think that will play into our ability to reduce NOx and N2O. So these are both advantageous. In terms of startup, though, I still think we're going to be challenged by just keeping the reactivity high and trying to enhance that at the beginning. So yeah, these are fun challenges.
And in your opinion, what would be the next step to look at in terms of dual fuel? I heard just recently people talking about DME to bring down again CO2 fossil-based type of emissions. I know that all the work that you're doing, again, just the diesel that you're going on, and some of the work from Christine on gasoline. So there are so many talks now on what would be that dual fuel. So in your opinion, what would the one that we need to look at?
I mean, I'm a big fan of DME if you have it, because DME obviously doesn't have the same soot formation pathways that, say, diesel would. And we would have a highly reactive diesel. DME is highly reactive, and could be used at really low pilot substitution. So I think I think DME is really interesting. Of course, you have to have it with you. If you're using it, you have to be producing it. But I do think moving the pilot level, I think what I see in the literature, and there is, as you mentioned, a lot of literature, coming out right now, that the pilot levels are going down and down and down of diesel, and so you may get down to points where we have significantly lowered diesel substitution. But of course, we need to be careful about ammonia slip. So yeah, all interesting. So I like DME, but I think diesel is probably most available and probably will be used in practical application.
Brilliant, brilliant, excellent. Thanks, Will.
Okay,
I can follow. I
Kitana?
can ask you one. So, Will, just your opinion on pre-chamber assisted combustion, so tubular jet ignition of these strategies for ammonia engines. So, what's your thoughts about those?
Yeah, I'm very bullish. I'm very bullish on pre-chamber. I think pre-chamber is a very promising avenue, and I've noticed some groups, and including ours, we're starting some pre-chamber work as well, because I think it can overcome some of these reactivity problems that we're having in the spark ignition type realm. Some of the challenges with pre-chamber, I think we're going to see are the pre-chamber and turbulent jet ignition systems that have been designed for high reactivity, high energy content fuels may not be appropriate. And so what you're seeing is that there's a group at Tsinghua doing some work, and I saw some group out of Switzerland a couple of days ago doing some pre-chamber work with ammonia. But typically, a high reactivity fuel would go into the pre-chamber and then would be used because of the constrained volumes that you have. So yes, I think there's more to come in pre-chamber. I think that's a really good comment. So I didn't include that, but that is definitely more to come.
Thank you.
Okay, any further questions? Okay, I've perhaps got one. Would you be able to comment perhaps on some of the challenges of achieving ignition in spark ignition engines with ammonia? In that, are there some particular strategies that are looking promising? For instance, much higher spark energies, multiple spark plugs, to attempt to minimize this coefficient of variation problems.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Certainly the high ignition energy is required. Higher ignition energy is required even than methane in some cases. There have been some studies reported that high ignition energy is important, but mostly spark duration is important. That's not necessarily like a very high burst of power in the discharge, but over some longer period of time to allow the spark kernel to develop. So I do think that is necessary, and I know that some companies, including Mala, are looking at developing high ignition energy type systems that would be appropriate for ammonia combustion in SI. We're using a high energy sort of racing coil pack to enable us to run and to get the results that we have. So I do think that this isn't necessary, but I think to put a point on this, though, obviously spark plug durability is going to be an issue, because if you're looking at running higher and higher compression ratios, which we are with ammonia, I think we're going to see that spark plug durability will be an issue for long-term sort of engine operation. So that's something I think that will need to be addressed. That's more practical down the road, but certainly.
Okay, thank you. Okay, further questions?
Well, I can always ask one more. So,
Yeah.
So, well, in more from an open discussion here, from a optical measurements point of view, what do you think would be most important for the development of these engines? And it was a very broad question, but moving away from diesel and going to ammonia, what do you think is really what we should be looking at?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, we've dabbled in lift measurements ourselves, so I kind of understand a little bit of the challenges based on that last talk, which was really interesting. Understanding what could be done. I think I think, as was mentioned, there's no N2O diagnostic right now that I think is practical. I think that would be interesting to understand. And I think that's key. I think understanding flows of unburned ammonia into crevices and that understanding of those flows, I think, is important from a diagnostic standpoint. And then, of course, just the general characterization of turbulent flame speed propagation in an engine cylinder, which I think we've seen some of the simulated results. I think I'd like to see some of the more optical engine type work go into that. But yeah, I think those are the main things. I'd like to understand blow by and engine cylinder interactions, but I'm not sure that's more of a, I'm not sure if that's a optical challenge or not, because usually optical engines have very weird oil situations. So yeah, I think it's a different, maybe a different topic, but certainly I definitely like to see some of the interactions with nitrogen chemistry and N2O.
Okay, thank you. I was taking notes. So.
No, I think Augustine has another question.
Yeah, yes. Going into to some of these general ideas and subjects, one of the questions that I've always had, and I keep asking Christine and the guys in Nottingham, is the potential impact on materials. And they say, well, we haven't seen anything. Now, one of the things that is coming out from the Japanese group in Tokyo is the nitration that we know occurs with ammonia, and we have seen as well hydrogen embrittlement. Have you experienced any material related issue that we're not aware of?
So far beyond the just poor choices of sealing materials that we've made. Incompatible materials that we mistakenly have put in our fuel system. No, we haven't seen any of that, but of course we haven't done long-term durability yet. One of the things that I think I'm curious about is not necessarily metallic interactions, but it's more on the lube oil side. Yeah. And I think the lube oil formulation is something that that nobody's thinking about right now, or maybe some people are, but it's certainly going to be a factor. So new lube oil formulations are going to be required. Additive packages are going to be very different. And looking at ammonia loves water, of course. So anything that involves the interaction with water and the lube oil, I think, is something that is going to be really key. I think we're going to start looking at that this summer, actually, this summer lube oil effects. Yeah. But yeah, I haven't seen anything yet, Augustine, but I'm sure as more engines are run longer, we're going to see some more effects.
Brilliant. Thanks, Will.
Okay. This looks like a good time to thank the speaker once again, unless we've got any further questions. Going. Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Northrop.